The king of a silent empire just heard his first sound, and it wasn't a symphony. It was the ticking of a clock counting down to his own execution. In the neon-soaked rain of new Zenith, power was measured in whispers. But for Tobin Grey, the world had been a mute film for 40 years. He was the architect, a man of granite poise who ruled the city's shipping docks and shadows with an iron hand and a silent heart. Born into a sensory vacuum, Tobin had built a fortress of absolute detachment, reading the flutter of a pulse in a traitor's neck or the twitch of a lie on a politician's lips with terrifying precision. To the underworld, he was a phantom, unstoppable because he couldn't be charmed or reasoned with. He didn't need to hear a plea for mercy to deny it. But underneath the expensive charcoal suits and the cold gray eyes of the city's most feared man lay a secret. He was a prisoner of a silence he didn't choose, waiting for a dawn he couldn't imagine.
Tobin Grey sat behind a desk carved from a single slab of obsidian, 40 stories above the grinding noise of the harbor. To Tobin, the city was a game of vibrations and light. A shipment of narcotics was a flickering green icon on a monitor. A rival's elimination was a silent red complete. He had built his empire on the Sanitized Protocol. No physical meetings, no direct contact, every command issued through encrypted text. He lived in a pressurized sanctuary of steel and glass, a king who governed a world he refused to touch. The isolation was his armor. After a betrayal in his youth that left him physically scarred and profoundly deaf, Tobin decided that the only way to rule was from a distance. He was the ultimate strategist because he had no skin in the game. But as he watched the rain lash against the reinforced glass, he felt a strange, hollow weight. He ruled everything, yet he possessed nothing that felt real. He was a master of control who was controlled by his own fear of the messy, unpredictable nature of human connection. That morning, a new element entered his sterile world. Rowan, a housekeeper vetted by 3 layers of security, was tidying the outer office. She moved with a grounded grace that Tobin found distracting. She didn't scurry like the others. She walked with a rhythmic pace that he could feel through the floorboards. She stopped in front of an antique grandfather clock, the only relic of his father he allowed in the room. Tobin watched her through the one-way mirror. She didn't just dust the clock, she placed her hand against the wood, closing her eyes as if listening to its heartbeat. Then she did something unthinkable. She looked directly at the hidden camera, her eyes piercing through the high-tech veil. She didn't look afraid, she looked expectant. Tobin felt a jolt in his chest, a vibration that didn't come from the floor. It was the first crack in the glass.
The next day, Tobin did something he hadn't done in 20 years. He stayed in the room when she arrived. He sat at his desk, his back to the door, waiting for the familiar vibration of her footsteps. When the electronic lock hissed open, the air in the room seemed to change. He felt her presence like a sudden heat. She didn't start cleaning. She walked directly to the spot behind his chair. Tobin's hand went instinctively to the silent alarm button, but he stopped. He felt a light touch on the side of his head, near the scar behind his right ear. It was the first time in a decade he had been touched by another human. The contact was electric, a surge of raw reality that made his lungs seize. Rowan's fingers moved with surgical precision. She wasn't attacking, she was searching. She found a small metallic ridge beneath the skin, a surgical implant so deep no doctor had ever bothered to look for it. With a sharp, sudden pressure, she manipulated the device. A sound, a terrifying, jagged, roaring sound, tore through Tobin's brain. It was the sound of his own ragged breath.
He collapsed against the desk, clutching his head as 40 years of silence were shattered by the violent arrival of the world. The hum of the air filtration was a roar. The ticking of the clock was a hammer hitting an anvil. He looked at Rowan, his vision blurring. She wasn't a housekeeper. She was a key. "They didn't just break you, Tobin." Her lips moved, and for the first time he heard the rasp of a human voice. "They imprisoned you. The fever that took your hearing was a lie. This device was a dampener, placed there by the people who wanted a puppet they could whisper around." Tobin stood up, his legs shaking. The world was too loud, too heavy, and terrifyingly real. The realization was a cold blade in his gut. The Reed family, his allies and partners for 3 decades, had been the ones to provide the doctors after his childhood accident. Calloway Reed had comforted Tobin's mother while ensuring he would never hear their hushed conversations about the slow dismantling of the Grey legacy. He hadn't been a king, he had been a ghost they kept in a box. Tobin walked to the window. The city was no longer a silent map, it was a cacophony. The distant sirens, the screeching of tires, the rhythmic thrum of the harbor, it all flooded in, a tidal wave of sensory data he had no idea how to process. He felt small. He felt vulnerable. The architect was dead, and Tobin Grey was an infant in a world of wolves. "Why?" he croaked. His own voice sounded like sandpaper in his throat. "Why show me now?" Rowan looked at the clock. "Because the contract on your life was signed an hour ago. They think you're still in the dark, Tobin. They think you can't hear the knives being sharpened in the next room." As if on cue, a soft chime sounded from the intercom. In the past, a light would have flashed. Now he heard the digital ping, a sharp, artificial needle of sound. He pressed the button. "Mr. Grey?" It was Milo, his head of security, a man he had trusted for 20 years. Milo's voice was smooth, but now Tobin could hear the underlying tremor, the upward inflection of a man holding a lie. "The Reeds are downstairs. Calloway says the harbor merger is ready for final signatures. Shall I bring them up?" Tobin looked at Rowan. The glass was gone. The war had begun. "Bring them up," he said. The elevator doors opened with a pneumatic hiss that made Tobin flinch. He sat perfectly still, hands folded on the obsidian desk. 3 men walked in: Calloway Reed, his son Ash, and Milo. In the old world, Tobin would have watched their lips. Now he heard the shush-shush of their leather shoes. He heard the rustle of the paper in Calloway's briefcase. "Tobin," Calloway said. His voice was a rich baritone, dripping with false warmth. "A grand day. 1 signature and the city is ours forever." Calloway slid a fountain pen across the desk. The sound of metal rolling over wood was like a pebble skittering across a frozen lake. Tobin didn't pick up the pen. He looked at Calloway, really seeing him for the first time. "You look tired, Calloway," Tobin said. He was listening to his own voice now, letting the vibration carry the weight of his new authority. "Did you sleep well? Or did the sound of your own conscience keep you awake?" Calloway's smile faltered. Tobin heard the sharp intake of breath from Ash. It was a small sound, but in the new clarity of his world, it was as loud as a gunshot. Behind him, Tobin heard a soft metallic click. It was the sound of a safety being flicked off a handgun. Milo, his loyal hound, was stepping into position. In the past, Tobin would have been dead before he felt the air move. Now, he heard the internal mechanism of the firearm reset. He heard the shift in Milo's weight. "Milo," Tobin said softly, not turning around. "The gun you're holding? It's a Beretta, isn't it? I can hear the spring in the magazine. It's a bit worn. You really should take better care of your tools." The room went dead silent. Milo's jaw dropped. The gun wobbled in his hand. The architect wasn't deaf. The puppet had cut his strings.
You can hear?" Calloway stammered, his face turning a sickly shade of gray. "I can hear everything, Calloway," Tobin said, taking a step forward. Each footfall sounded like a drumbeat of doom. "I can hear the way your heart is racing. I can hear the sweat breaking out on Ash's forehead. And I can hear the 40 years of lies you've fed me like poison." Tobin reached into his pocket and pulled out the small metallic device Rowan had extracted. He tossed it onto the desk. It landed with a tiny, tinny clink. "Rowan showed me the truth. You didn't want a partner. You wanted a ghost. Someone who wouldn't hear you planning to strip my assets in the very room where I sat." Calloway lunged for the desk, but Tobin was faster. He didn't use a gun. He used the raw, visceral power of a man who had finally reconnected with his own body. He grabbed Calloway's wrist, the sound of the man's bones creaking, echoing through the room. "The merger is over," he hissed, "and so is the read line." Suddenly the lights flickered and died. The emergency red lights kicked in, bathing the office in blood-colored light. Tobin heard the heavy clunk of the primary security doors locking. They were sealing him in. "Kill him!" Calloway screamed, his voice cracking with panic. Milo leveled the gun, but Tobin didn't flinch. He listened. He heard the rhythm of Milo's fear, the way the man was breathing, too fast, too shallow. Tobin moved not where Milo was looking, but where Milo was going to fire. The first shot missed, the sound of the bullet shattering a glass trophy case like 1,000 diamonds hitting the floor. Tobin tackled Milo, the physical impact a jarring symphony of bone and muscle. He didn't kill him, he neutralized him with a precision born of years of observing physical mechanics. He grabbed Milo's radio. "The architect is dead," Tobin whispered into the device, his voice pitched low. "But Tobin Grey is coming down. Tell the men in the lobby that the glass is broken." He heard the static on the other end, the sound of confusion and growing terror among the Reed soldiers. Tobin grabbed Rowan's hand. They had to move. The penthouse was a high-tech cell, and Hale, his former lieutenant who now ran the security firm, would have every sensor turned against him. They pried open the service elevator doors, the sound of metal grinding against metal, a visceral scream. They began the descent down the service ladder, 40 stories of shadows. Every rung Tobin touched was a year of his life he was reclaiming. "Why did you do it?" Tobin asked, his voice echoing in the shaft. "My father was the one who hid you after the accident." Rowan's voice came from below, steady and calm. "He died believing he had saved a king. I wanted to see if he had just saved a ghost." Tobin stopped, his hands gripping the iron rungs until they bled. He realized he wasn't just running for his life, he was running for his soul. He had to be more than a survivor. He had to be a redeemer. They reached the basement, the air thick with the smell of oil and old stone. Tobin could hear the muffled shouts of soldiers in the lobby above. He knew the building was surrounded. But the Reeds didn't know about the harbor tunnels, the old smuggling routes that predated the city's modernization. "The harbor," Tobin whispered. "If we can reach the water, we can disappear." They moved through the damp corridors, the pipes groaning with the weight of the city. Tobin felt a new sense of power. It wasn't the distant, filtered power of the director. It was the raw, dangerous energy of a man in the mud. But then he heard a sound that made his blood run cold, the steady electronic beep of a tracking device. He realized the tracker was in the watch Milo had given him for his 10-year anniversary. He ripped it off and threw it into a pile of industrial waste.
"They're close," Rowan whispered. She could hear the splashing of boots in the water behind them. Tobin realized the tunnels weren't an escape. They were a kill box. He stopped in front of a heavy iron wheel, the old floodgate. If he could open it, the harbor surge would flush the tunnel, but he would drown everyone behind him. The moral weight of the decision had a sound, a low humming vibration in his chest. "It's them or us," Tobin muttered, but he looked at the gate and saw a third way. He didn't open the gate fully. He opened a secondary pressure valve. The roar of the water was a primal force. It didn't come as a wall of death, but as a blinding, deafening mist, a sensory overload that neutralized the soldiers' high-tech goggles and silenced their communications. Tobin and Rowan moved through the whiteout, guided not by sight, but by the rhythm of the water hitting the walls. Tobin heard a soldier stumble nearby. He could have ended him. Instead, Tobin grabbed the man's shoulder and guided him to a higher ledge. "Go home," Tobin whispered in the man's ear. "The war is over." The soldier, terrified and blinded by the mist, scrambled away. This was the transformation. Tobin wasn't just fighting for territory. He was fighting to break the cycle of violence that had defined his silence. Every man he spared was a brick removed from the reed fortress. He heard the soldiers retreating, their voices filled with a superstitious dread. They weren't fighting a man. They were fighting a ghost who showed mercy. They reached the harbor exit, a heavy wooden door that led to a derelict pier. Tobin pushed it open, and the midnight air hit him like a physical blessing. He heard the gulls, the distant foghorn, the soft lap of waves. It was a symphony he had waited 40 years to hear. But standing at the end of the pier, illuminated by a single flickering street lamp, was Hale. He held a detonator in his hand. Hale laughed, a sharp, artificial sound that cut through the night air. "You actually made it out, Tobin. The death boy found his ears. But you're still in my box. This pier is rigged. One click, and you and your housekeeper become part of the harbor silt." Tobin didn't run. He walked toward Hale, the rhythmic thud of his boots on the wood the only sound in the world. "You won't do it, Hale," Tobin said softly. He didn't shout. He spoke with the quiet, absolute authority of a man who had seen the gears of the world. "Why not?" Hale sneered, his finger twitching on the button. "I've spent 20 years managing your fear. I know exactly what you're made of." "You know what the director was made of, but you don't know me. You've spent 20 years learning how to look away from the truth, but I've spent 40 years learning how to listen to the silence." Tobin stopped 3 feet from him. He could hear Hale's heart skipping a beat. He could hear the sweat dripping from the man's brow. "The men in the building, they're walking away, Hale. I gave them a choice they didn't have to pay for. I gave them life. What can you give them besides a grave?" Tobin reached out, his hand open. He wasn't reaching for the detonator. He was reaching for the man. "The glass is broken. You don't have to be a jailer anymore." Hale stared at Tobin, his eyes wide with a primal terror. He saw the scars, the dirt, the raw humanity. He dropped the detonator. It clattered against the wood, a small, pathetic sound. Hale fell to his knees, his face in his hands. He wasn't a villain anymore. He was just a man who had been lost in the noise of his own greed. Tobin didn't punish him. He simply walked past him. The ultimate justice wasn't a bullet. It was the weight of one's own choices in the newfound clarity of the light. He walked to the end of the pier where Rowan was waiting. The sun was beginning to touch the horizon, a silent explosion of orange and gold. But it wasn't silent to Tobin. He heard the sizzle of the tide on the sand. He heard the rustle of the wind. He heard his own heart, not as a mechanical drum, but as a steady, peaceful rhythm. "What now?" Rowan asked. "Now we rebuild, but not with glass and steel. We build with the things that make a sound." He realized that his authority didn't come from the height of his penthouse or the depth of his secrets. It came from the sacrifice of his old self. He had died as the architect so he could live as a man. The city of Zenith was waking up, a symphony of car horns, construction, and human voices. Tobin listened to it all. It wasn't a map anymore. It was a living, breathing body. He took Rowan's hand, and for the first time in 40 years, he wasn't afraid of the touch. He was the most powerful man in the city, not because he controlled the silence, but because he finally knew what was worth listening to. Tobin Grey vanished from the headlines of Zenith. The architect became a legend, a ghost story whispered in the docks, the king who traded an empire for a song. He spent his days in a small house by the sea, teaching local children how to read the patterns of the waves and the language of the wind. He had found a kingdom that didn't require a fortress and a peace that didn't require a dampener. He had been born in silence, lived in a lie, and was finally resurrected in the truth. The glass was gone, the war was over, and the world was finally singing.